Leading through adversity is one of those areas where a lot of people get focused when adversity happens, and the idea of the ups and downs of life. If the seas turn stormy and suddenly the wind is against you and you're being tossed and blown, you're set out on a journey, this journey of life or the journey of the new year, and everything changes and suddenly you're battling the elements. That's a hard place to be, and most people react to things differently. So whether it's I've lost my business, it's been destroyed, I've had to shut down, I ran out of money, whatever it might be, those are things that press in on or make the seas really rough. And for some people, they're rougher than they are for others. But this current circumstance has really, truly impacted everyone. There's no one who's not affected by it in some way, shape, or form. So when the storms come, it's often that our initial response is internal. What do I need to do? How does this impact me? What is my issue here? And so when adversity comes, our first reaction is, I'm going to just deal with it. Or I got it handled. Or I'm going to respond. And sometimes that response is passivity. One of the greatest challenges we face as men in the world is being passive instead of active. So adversity comes and it brings us to the point where I'm just going to deal with it. I'm going to handle it on my own. I'm going to figure this out. Or I'm going to respond by overreacting or underreacting or not reacting at all. And so often we start thinking internally first versus the direction we're headed or where we're going. And it reminds me of this great story in Matthew chapter 14 where Jesus had just fed the 5,000. And at the end of that section in Scripture, he starts on, at the end of the feeding the 5,000, he says, he sends the disciples in a boat and says, you go to the other side of the sea. And then Jesus turns back and he releases the people who were there to be fed. And then he goes up to the mountain to pray. And he's there for a period of time. And the disciples are out in the boat and they're pressing ahead and they're going forward and they're struggling with what's going on because the wind's against them, as he says. And so in that process, Jesus goes and he spends time with the Father. He gets his connection, his collaboration, his sustenance from the Father who has sent him here. And later in the evening, he comes down to the water and he sees the boats out there, but they're struggling in their battle to get across because the wind's against them and they're having a hard time. And so he decides to walk across water to come and out to the boat. And in the midst of this going on, the disciples are struggling. They're battling this and they have fear. And when they see someone coming toward them, they're afraid. And then Jesus says these great, kind words. He says, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Because he knew they were afraid. They were having a hard time getting where he sent them. And he said, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. And then Peter says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out to you. And Jesus simply says one word. He says, come. So Peter gets out of the boat, is looking at Jesus, and he's walking on the water. And then something interesting happens. He takes his eyes off where he's going. And he looks around, and he sees his environment. And he sees the wind and the waves, and he has fear sets in, and he starts to sink. And he says, Lord, help me. Save me. And Jesus reaches out his hand and picks him up and gets him back in the boat and calms the sea.